Warning, this episode may contain disturbing content, soothing narration, and mild existential dread. Basically, murder ASMR for stressed professionals. Listener discretion is advised. Hell, it might be necessary.
He was a good man. That's what Butch Martin's family says about him. Marcia Pool's family tells a very different story. The problem with these kinds of stories is that they assume a tidy truth in black and white, when the truth of human beings is almost always an uncomfortable shade of gray. Two things can be true at once. The Butch Martin that Marcia Pool's friends and families feared can be the same Butch that his family loved and defended. No one is sunshine and unicorn farts 100% of the time, and the face we present often depends on who's looking. What isn't supposed to change is the evidence. But when you're talking about a fire, that's a dangerous assumption, because arson investigation has undergone one of the most dramatic scientific revolutions in modern forensic history. For decades, fire investigation was the Wild West, where investigators played fast and loose with rules that collapsed under the weight of legitimate scientific scrutiny. Folklore dressed itself up as forensic certainty and walked into courtrooms and pointed the finger at defendants who never stood a chance. Butch Martin and his supporters say he was one of those defendants, an unlucky man caught between circumstance and fire mythology. Marcia Pool's family disagrees. They say Butch Martin wasn't a victim at all, but the perpetrator of a crime so devastating that no amount of time can soften its edges. They say the push for his exoneration ignores the man he really was, the one he hid from his own family and from an appeals court that ultimately set him free. Butch Martin spent 24 years branded a felon, serving 3 consecutive life sentences for killing a young mother and her 2 children. But today he is free, his conviction overturned. And what remains are 2 dueling narratives. One insisting justice was finally served, the other insisting justice was undone. So the question becomes, what do you believe? Can you sort out the real Butch Martin from this case? Because if you've listened to other coverage, you probably already have an opinion, but we're going to tell the story a different way, right now, on the fire folklore that convicted Butch Martin, here on Crime to Burn. Welcome to Crime to Burn, where we explore the dark, sooty landscape where true crime intersects with arson and criminal negligence. Join us as we sift through the ashes to bring you the story of what really happened. Welcome back to Crime to Burn. I'm April, a fire protection engineer, former firefighter, and sworn foe of forensic folklore.
And I have no idea why I'm here.
If you're joining us for the first time or you've been here since the beginning, we're so glad that you're here today. A quick personal update. This week, we forked over $1,645 to the Georgia Supreme Court for court records, so we can bring you an explosive new series that's going to knock your socks off. The problem is, we've actually never made $1,645 producing this podcast, not even close. But you, and this is the important part, are worth it. And all we ask in return is your help finding our audience. The best way to do that is head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a 5-star rating. And if you've got 30 seconds, a written review goes even further. We got 4 new Apple reviews this week, so we owe some thanks to Jazzy Prince 89, who thinks I have a soothing voice.
She does. You're right.
Hi, Jazzy Prince. And also my friends over at Unsolved Couple Pod, go check them out. Buff Beth 22, who hates my cliffhangers but loves us anyway. And Snips, who thinks Steve is awesome but thinks that the host and co-host are more awesome.
I also hate your cliffhangers. And you have no idea how many cliffhangers this lady has a day.
I run out of thoughts sometimes in the middle of a thought.
I'll be sitting there trying to be respectful for a good 45 seconds. At some point, you're like, what's the rest of the story?
I'm guilty as charged. I'm sorry. Thank you to every single one of you. We are now up to 63 5-star reviews on Apple as of this recording, and over on Spotify we've climbed to 65 5-star ratings. Now I can't see who you are over on Spotify, but you make me feel things, good things, and I appreciate that.
In our pants.
And to Kenjo, thank you for your Spotify episode comment and for recognizing us as the luxury podcast that spends more than it makes bringing you good content. We laughed, we cried, and we considered starting a GoFundMe. And Brittany Baker, who left us a Podbean comment, thank you, and we think you are awesome too. But wait, we do have one wee financial boost you can give us if it's in your budget. We have a Patreon, and if you join, you'll get ad-free episodes and bonus content as soon as I find time to edit, because there's a bonus episode that's been sitting in my editing queue for over a month, and I will make it to publication, probably, hopefully. Pray for me.
Most likely.
Anyway, if you want to help us shoulder those court fees and keep this show running, head on over to our Patreon, the link's in the show notes, and throw us a few sympathy dollars to get your episodes ad-free. Or if that is not in the cards for you, no worries. Crime to Burn will always be free on your favorite podcast platform, just with ads. You can still help us in huge ways by following us on YouTube, TikTok, X, Instagram, and Facebook, and interacting with our content there with likes, follows, comments, shares, and saves. Those things do help us stay algorithmically relevant, and that exposure helps us find new audience members. For example, Elizabeth Kimball 22 did her part to keep us relevant this week by presenting her dearly departed mother as an allergen. It is a long story, and you're going to have to go back in my reels about the Sarah Hartsfield case to find her commenting in context, but Elizabeth, I thank you. Finally, send us your fire stories, case suggestions, feedback, and unhinged life hacks at crimetoburn@gmail.com. And in case anyone's been following along, I have been fighting a public records battle with the Pima County, Arizona Attorney's Office for the past 6 months. In light of their failure to produce records in accordance with Arizona state statutes, I have officially signed up to speak at the Board of Supervisors meeting in Pima County on Tuesday morning, January 20th. So if you're local and you would like to watch me stir a very large pot, feel free to attend. I believe there is a way to listen remotely as well, and I will confirm that on social media. It should be a good time for everyone except Laura Conover's office, which might find it a little bit uncomfortable since the Board of Supervisors controls her budget and all that. Sometimes you gotta light a fire to get results. Figuratively, because literal fires would be arson and go directly against the mission of this podcast.
That's important to say.
Now let's talk about Butch Martin and the arson and murder case that landed him in prison for 24 years. Before we dive in, there's a few important source notes. First, Texas Tech produced an excellent 2-part interview with the Innocence Project attorney who worked on Butch's case in their podcast called Fearless. I will link it in the show notes, and it explains the legal aspects extremely well, and it includes a lot of information that you are not going to get from a casual Google search. And secondly, the Wrongful Conviction podcast also covered this case, and they actually interviewed Butch Martin himself, and hearing him describe his experience in his own words is very powerful. So I will include that link as well, and I highly recommend it for additional context. But here's what I'm doing differently. Most podcasts that present this case present it as a foregone conclusion, and I'm not going to do that, and it's intentional. There are family members of the victim who firmly believe that Butch is guilty, and I respect their perspective. So instead of starting with the problems in the case, we're going to start with what the jury heard, what the jury initially heard in the initial trial. And that is the evidence that initially convicted him. And it is a biased presentation because the prosecution's case was biased. And that's how adversarial systems work. And yes, it will probably sound like I think he's guilty. But in part 2, I'm going to turn it on its head and present what the appellate court heard during his exoneration proceedings. And it may sound like I've flip-flopped. I've done neither. The structure is a flip-flop, but it's the only honest way to show you how 2 courts can look at the same event and reach opposite conclusions. So I'm going to ask that you reserve judgment on Butch, on the exoneration, on all of it until you've heard both sides. So don't form an opinion on half of the story, and please don't mistake the structure of this series for bias. And when we wrap up this case, I will tell you what I believe, but I also want you to decide what you believe. So let's get started with his name. Butch isn't his birth name, it's a nickname. His legal name is Garland Leon Martin, and he was born in Odessa, Texas in September of 1962. Now, his family moved to Midland when he was young, and Midland is where he stayed. Now, if you don't know much about Midland, here's a quick primer. It has been growing like crazy, but in 1998, when this fire took place, Midland had a population of under 120,000 people. Since then, the population has grown about 45%, compared to roughly 21% growth for the United States as a whole. Now, Midland sits in West Texas, which is basically midway between Dallas and El Paso. In fact, it originally existed because it was the halfway point between those 2 cities, but then in the 1920s, oil was discovered and Midland transformed into a thriving oil town, one that has ridden the roller coaster of both booms and busts ever since. But back to Butch. He graduated from high school and started out welding for oil companies, but when the oil industry hit one of its periodic downturns, he left that line of work and became a repo man. Now, somewhere in that window, he also got married and had his first child. That marriage was short-lived. It lasted only about 3 years. And then Butch met Marcia Pool in the most Texas love story ever. They met at a cockfight.
And that's not where 2 wieners are dueling it out.
The next line is, "Not that kind, you dirty mongrel. The worst kind. The kind where roosters battle to the death."
I'm not sure in this context that's the worst kind, honestly.
Okay. Unsavory? Yes, but that's what happened. Now, Butch spotted young Marcia sitting on a bar stool doing a shot of tequila and holding her newborn infant son, Brady.
That is Texas's
So Butch went over and asked her for a shot of tequila, and she handed him her baby instead. And Butch said that is how he fell in love with Marcia and with Brady.
God damn, man. I hope he had a squatted truck and a mullet.
Now, the wisdom of taking a baby to a cockfight is not something I'm going to opine about, but it is worth noting that at the time, Marcia Pool was only 20 years old. I guess cockfights don't have strict ID checks. Butch, on the other hand, was 32, 12 years her senior. But despite the age difference and the very non-traditional meet-cute, the kind you'll never find in a Hallmark movie, the two hit it off, according to Butch, and were immediately inseparable. Shortly thereafter, they moved in together, and before long, they welcomed a daughter, Kristin. Now, you'll hear many reports refer to Marcia as Butch's wife, and while they did have a child together and they were living as a family, Butch says that she turned him down every time he suggested they get married because, in her words, things were going just fine and she didn't want to screw it up. So Butch, Marcia, and little Brady, now 3 years old, and Kristin, about 18 months old, were at home on the night of February 25th, 1998, when Butch got a call from a friend. The friend told Butch that he needed help measuring for a fence that a client wanted him to build, and Butch agreed to go help him. He says he kissed Marcia goodbye, left her asleep with the kids, and headed out with his friend when he came to pick him up. On the way there, the two stopped for some beers, and then they went to the property where they measured the fence line.
Whoa, was this in the morning?
No, this was at night.
On their way to measure a fence job at night, they grabbed themselves some beers.
Yep.
That sounds like a great job.
On their drive back, Butch recalled seeing a police car go tearing past them at high speeds with lights flashing, and moments later they crested a hill and saw where that car was headed because a huge black plume of smoke was rising into the night sky. According to Butch, he commented that the smoke looked like it could be coming from near his home, and it was his house that was on fire.
Whoa.
When Butch and his friend pulled up, Butch leapt out of the truck, frantic, searching for Marcia and the kids. Not seeing them outside, he ran to the front door and tried to open it, but it was stuck. Now, the house was already fully involved when he arrived, and the front door was scalding hot. But despite the burns he was sustaining, Butch continued to throw his body against it, trying unsuccessfully to force it open. Smoke was pouring out of the structure, and he kept having to retreat into the fresh air to catch his breath and then go back and try again. But the door would not budge. Now, at this point, Butch was in a full-blown panic. He was suffering from burns and repeatedly trying to open the door, and officers on the scene already knew the hard truth that Butch was not ready to fathom. No one inside that house could have survived those conditions. But Butch wasn't about to give up, so he kept trying to break down the door, and when that failed, he ran around to Kristin's room where he broke a window. Now, the second he did, the sudden inrush of oxygen triggered a flashover, and flames shot out the opening, making any attempt to enter impossible. Now, we've talked about flashover before, but for those of you who are new here, here's a crash course. Flashover is a transition point in a fire. Specifically, it's the moment when a room goes from having a fire in it to having the entire room on fire. Fires put out huge amounts of heat and smoke, and that smoke isn't just burned stuff, it also contains unburned fuel in the form of flammable gases and vapors released from the room's contents as they heat up. When the compartment heats to the point where nearly everything in the room is off-gassing flammable vapors, that smoke layer is superheated and that space becomes primed for flashover. At that moment, the only thing missing is enough oxygen. So when Butch broke that window, he provided exactly what that superheated, fuel-rich atmosphere needed: fresh air. And the minute that oxygen rushed in, the room transitioned into flashover with flames rolling out of that opening. Now, at this point, officials on scene needed Butch to calm down and stay out of the way for his own personal safety. When he wouldn't, police tackled him and handcuffed him to a cruiser. Now, where Butch lived in Midland, neighbors aren't close. They're spread out. We're talking acres. So one of his neighbors, who lived a little over a mile away, some reports say 2 miles, actually showed up, and when he saw Butch handcuffed to this cruiser, he goes to try to comfort him. And the cops, and this is wild, they tell that neighbor that he needs to get Butch out of here. This is too traumatic for him. So will you take him to your house and keep him there?
Is this a small town thing? Like,
yeah.
Did they know him?
Yeah, in fact, Butch knew the sheriff.
That makes more sense when you put it in that context.
So the neighbor agrees, but they didn't unhandcuff Butch. They just gave the neighbor The cops' keys to Butch's handcuffs got Butch into his vehicle, and off they go to the neighbor's house. So Butch pretended to calm down so that his buddy eventually uncuffs him, which was a bad idea because as soon as he did, Butch knocked over his friend and sprinted more than a mile back to the burning home where he had to be subdued again. When firefighters finally got the fire out, it became tragically clear why Butch hadn't been able to get the front door open. Marcia's body was wedged against it. And this is incredibly common. When people wake up in a burning home, they're already hypoxic or low on oxygen because smoke displaces breathable air. They're confused, disoriented, and clumsy, and many people make it to the front door but are just too impaired to actually get it open. Now, if Marcia woke up to heavy smoke, she would have already been oxygen-starved, probably panicked, and trying to find her children, and all of that increased respiratory demand at the exact moment when available oxygen is dropping just worsens that hypoxia and continues to impair motor function. Brady, her little boy, was found on the floor near his mother, and 1-year-old Kristin was found in her crib. Butch was finally transported to a hospital and treated for his burns, and then he was transferred to a psychiatric facility because he was absolutely devastated over the loss of Marcia and the kids. Now at this point, everything Butch had owned was gone. His house was destroyed, and he only had the clothes that he had been wearing the night of the fire. But a few days later, the police showed up at the psychiatric facility and asked him for those clothes, and Butch handed them over. They made sure to ask him if he had washed them since the fire, and of course he had. They were his only clothes. And when Butch was released, he went with the police to the house to walk the scene so that he could point out anything that he thought might be unusual. And then the following April, Butch was arrested and charged with arson and 3 counts of murder for the deaths of Marcia, Brady, and Kristin. So let's talk about what the jury heard. Now, the state's theory, according to the prosecution, Marcia Pool and Butch Martin had a tumultuous relationship with a pattern of domestic abuse. They had argued shortly before the fire, and Marcia had threatened to leave Butch. Their theory was that Butch responded by taking lighter fluid, spraying it in the area of the back door, which according to reports was located in the master bedroom, but for clarity, I have not seen a floor plan of the house. I am relying on secondary sources. They alleged that he ignited the fire and then went to help his friend measure the fence, locking the sleeping mother and her 2 small children inside. Now, they were gone for approximately 30 minutes, and when they returned, the house was fully engulfed and Marcia and the kids could not be rescued. So what evidence did the state say supported this theory? When we look at crimes like this, we typically talk about 3 things: means, motive, and opportunity. So let's start with means. The prosecutor presented this as an intentionally set fire based on testimony of the fire investigator. Now, this was 1998, an era when most fire investigators were trained by their predecessors, not by standardized forensic methodology, and NFPA 921, the National Standard for Fire Investigation, was published in 1992, but it took almost 15 to 20 years for that to gain widespread acknowledgement and adoption. And like many new fire protection standards, it was often small and rural jurisdictions that were last to implement it. Bureaucracy moves slowly, staffing is limited, and budgets are tight. And training for fire investigators rarely outranks the need to keep aging fire engines running or stations maintained. So this investigator did not follow NFPA 921, but the jury would not have known whether that was an issue. They would have taken the investigator's testimony as fact. And here's what that testimony consisted of. They said they had ruled out all accidental causes of the fire. They said the fire began in the master bedroom and that laboratory testing had found the presence of 2 accelerants, lamp oil and lighter fluid. They observed pour patterns on the floor, which are irregularly shaped burn patterns with heavy charring on the edges, which at the time were widely believed to indicate the presence of an accelerant. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you probably have already spotted some of the issues with this testimony. But for now, just understand that this is what the jury heard, and your average juror would have had no reason to question the validity of these so-called facts. In addition to the physical evidence, the prosecution also had witness testimony. That friend of Butch's, the one who had picked him up to go measure for the fence, he told the jury that when Butch came out of the house that night, he didn't simply open the door and walk out. He had backed out of the doorway. Prosecutors framed this as evidence that he was pouring accelerant as he backed out. Now, I actually don't think that backing out of a front door is that unusual. I back out when I'm reaching in to grab my keys, or blocking the dog from rushing past me, or turning back to say something to someone inside. There are a million benign reasons to exit a door that way. But to a jury that had just been told that this fire was arson, that detail would absolutely hang suspicion around Butch's neck. So that covered means. Now let's move on to motive. It's not enough for prosecutors to allege a pattern of abuse results in murder, and even in relationships where abuse exists, that alone can't prove murder. They still have to establish some sort of motive. Now, one of the most common motives in arson cases is financial gain, life insurance policies or homeowners insurance payouts. But Butch had no life insurance policies and no homeowners insurance, and he lost everything in the fire. So the state needed another motive. Enter Marcia's mother, Mary Stevens. She took the stand and told the jury that earlier on the day of the fire, Marcia had called her and asked her to come get her and the kids. When Mary arrived, she heard an altercation between Butch and Marcia in which Marcia threatened to leave him. Mary testified that she heard Butch say to her daughter, quote, "If you try to leave me again, I'm going to kill you and your kids," unquote. Later that same day, Marcia and the children returned home. Now, don't misconstrue what I'm about to say. I have never personally been in an abusive cycle, and I am not an expert on domestic violence. I can only speak from my perspective, which is very limited. But from where I stand, if my partner's daughter had credibly threatened to kill her, I would not have let her go back to that house just a few hours later. But again, that reflects my worldview and not hers. It's also true that people sometimes say things like, "I'll kill you" in the heat of an argument without intending literal homicide.
They certainly do.
Is it a smart thing to say? No.
It's a spur-of-the-moment thought. It's an emotion, not premeditation.
Was it uncommon, especially in the late 90s? Also no. But I will be honest, the added threat towards the children gives this allegation a little bit of a sharper edge for me. So is it possible that Marcia and Butch had a fight and said things they didn't mean, and she went to her mom's to cool off and then came back home? Yes, it's possible. It's also possible that there was real fear and that she went back because domestic violence dynamics are complicated and dangerous and not always logical from the outside. That is also possible. What matters for the jury is that the state presented this testimony as motive, and without any financial incentive, it was essentially the only motive they had. So to reinforce that motive, the prosecution called additional witnesses to describe the relationship and Butch's behavior in the days leading up to the fire. So Dana Hendry testified that on February 24th, the day before the fire, Marcia had asked her for a ride to her mother's house so she could end the relationship with Butch. Hendry also testified that Butch made a similar threatening comment at that time. Sammy Carr testified that the night before the fire, Butch had been drinking and got into some sort of confrontation with his employer while on a beer run, and then returned to the house that he shared with Marcia and tried to light the grass on fire with a lighter. Now, when Sammy told him to stop, Butch allegedly said he was just joking.
Normal day in Texas.
And James Wood testified that Butch had once offered to help him burn down a trailer to commit insurance fraud.
Well, that's not such a normal day in Texas.
I don't know. I've never lived in Texas. Now, I want to be very clear here. The actual relationships of these individuals to Butch are not spelled out in court records that I've read. So, for example, the friend who took Butch to measure the fence was named Stacy Carr, so it's possible that Sammy Carr was a relative or an acquaintance involved in their construction work, but that's extrapolation on my part based on those surnames and not established fact. But the important point is that taken together, these witnesses supplied the prosecution with testimony that painted Butch as a volatile, threatening man that was familiar with using fire as a tool. Now let's talk about opportunity. Opportunity in this context is simple. Could Butch Martin have done this? Did he have access, time, and circumstances to set the fire and leave undetected? According to the prosecution, the answer was yes. They argued that on the night of the fire, Butch was home, awake, and alone with Marcia and the children before his friend arrived. He therefore had access to the house, to the alleged accelerants, and to the supposed ignition point. They also emphasized that Butch left with his friend for about 30 minutes, which they claimed was long enough for the fire to grow to the point of full involvement without allowing Marcia and the children time to escape. The state presented this window, the period between Butch leaving and the fire department arriving, as the perfect opportunity for a staged arson. And to support this, the prosecution painted several details. 1, Butch did not claim to have been anywhere other than the house and the job site. 2, there was no evidence of any sort of forced entry or a third party inside the home, but the home did burn up, so that one's kind of sketchy. And 3, Butch had knowledge of the family's routine, including that the children and Marcia were at home and sleeping. And 4, that the fire began during a period when Marcia would presumably have been vulnerable, asleep alone with 2 small children. To the jury, this completed the triad: means, intentionally setting the fire using accelerants; motive, anger over Marcia's threatening to leave; and opportunity, being the access, the timing, and his brief window of absence. From the prosecution's perspective, that was enough to argue not only that Butch could have done it, but that he did, and he used his errands with his friend as an alibi. And there was additional supporting evidence from the pathology side. Immediately after the fire, the medical examiner, a man named Dr. David Hoblet, ruled that the deaths were a result of smoke inhalation, noting that all 3 victims were alive when the fire started based on soot in their airways and elevated carbon monoxide levels in their blood. However, this presented a risk for the prosecution. Smoke inhalation alone does not prove intent, but if the jury didn't accept that the fire was arson, the state needed something else to suggest that Butch intended to harm his wife and children. So all 3 bodies were exhumed and examined by forensic anthropologist Dr. Harold Gilking. And Dr. Gilking claimed that he found swelling in the brains of both Marcia and Brady, but not in 1-year-old Kristin. Following this examination, Dr. Hoblet amended his findings. Both Hoblet and Gilking told the jury that Marcia and Brady had suffered blunt force trauma to the head prior to the fire. They went so far as to describe the trauma as consistent with being struck by a closed fist delivered with full arm swing.
Whose full arm swing?
Well, they're saying Butch did it. But remember, I'm presenting you with what the jury in the original trial heard.
I'm just suggesting that the guy who accused the person of arm swinging couldn't arm swing.
Now, I don't have the full transcripts, but I can find no mention anywhere of Gilking discussing skull injuries. And here's where I can't help but raise an eyebrow. I genuinely wonder if anyone defined for the jury what a forensic anthropologist actually does, because it doesn't have anything to do with soft tissue injuries or brains. Forensic anthropologists are experts in skeletal remains. If you wanted commentary on skull fractures, that would make sense. But brain swelling and soft tissue pathology? Not skeletal pathology? That's out of his area of expertise. And yet, based on the appellate opinion and reporting that I've reviewed, the evidence of trauma was described almost entirely in terms of brain swelling and not bone injury.
So someone showed up and showed the, air quote, people a f***ing magic trick.
Yeah. Then there were the paramedics who testified that they smelled an odor they thought was similar to lighter fluid on Butch when they transported him to the hospital. Finally, Stacy Carr, the man who had picked up Butch that night, told the jury not only about Butch backing out of the house, but also that on the drive, when that police car raced past them toward town, he said that Butch said to him, quote, "I hope they're not going to my house," unquote. And the prosecution framed this as some sort of smoking gun to imply that Butch already knew exactly where that cruiser was headed.
Do you have any idea of how many people I've heard say something similar to that?
Exactly.
Just anything happening around the world, just anything happening in your neighborhood.
You know, last week when I was researching the DuPont Hotel fire, there was one of the people that was in that travel group that had to leave to go pick up his wife right before the fire happened. And as he was leaving, fire trucks were going the other direction, and he thought, man, I hope they're not going to our hotel.
It's a normal thought. Like, who wouldn't think that? Oh, I'm glad it's not my house.
And a sheriff's deputy on scene testified that he overheard Butch tell his father, quote, "I won't be f***ing her anymore," unquote, without any emotion. But that testimony stands in direct tension with everything else we know about Butch's actions that night. The burns he sustained trying to get in the door, the window he broke out, the fact that he sprinted more than a mile back to the fire after being taken away. And if that's all you heard, if that was the sum total of information presented to you, I suspect you might be leaning toward believing Martin was guilty, and I wouldn't blame you, just as I don't blame the jury. Because when you strip this down to what the jury heard, this case comes down to which experts they believed, which experts had more credibility. Because the defense did push back. They hired their own experts, and they raised very valid points. But it wasn't enough to sway 12 people in that courtroom. And that brings us to the end of part 1. On the next episode of Crime to Burn, we're going to walk through the defense's case, the verdict, and how nearly 2 decades later, modern fire science and forensic review led to Butch Martin's exoneration. And that's this week's episode of Crime to Burn. And so here's the crash course for people that didn't see my initial video on Laura Conover's office. She's the county attorney for Pima County. When I started looking into her office because of a case, I noted that there was some statements that I would generously classify as a mischaracterization of what really happened, which made me question what other statements she might have made that could be generously classified as mischaracterizations. So I started digging into things like her campaign promises and statistics that she quoted, and I started noticing something alarming. Her case closure rate's really high because, and I believe, because the number of felonies that they're taking to court has nosedived since she took office, meaning she's giving lenient plea deals to potentially violent offenders. So then I started looking at crime statistics, and even though she said that the crime rate was dropping in her jurisdiction, the FBI crime data goes against that. And then I noticed that she's gotten it's $4 or $5 million in increased funding since she took office. And so I'm like, well, where's it going if they're not going to court? They've got lower staffing levels than they had before she took office. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's going into diversion programs. But diversion programs are showing a significantly higher failure rate compared to a national average, which can happen if you don't have good acceptance criteria or you're underfunding those programs. So that's not where that money's going. So then I said, okay, well, maybe it's going to victims relief because they do make victims relief payments. But that has also taken a nosedive. So they have lower staffing. They're taking significantly, the graph is a sharp drop off of how many felony indictments are going to court. They're not spending it on diversion programs, or if they are, they're spending it on failing diversion programs. And they are not spending it on, increased staffing, and they're certainly not spending it on their website, because even though I've told them 4 times, the CAPTCHA on their website is still broken, so you can't actually comment to their office through their website. So
that's not convenient, is it?
So I asked for some accounting records that are required for them to produce annually to justify their budgets. And I wanted to look into their budget more closely to see where they're spending this increased funding. And 6 months ago, I made this case. I made this request. And I have followed up religiously, asking for a timeline. And I understand that the records that I asked for are voluminous. So I've given them 6 months. And the information that I got back this week was that they've never even started. Or at least that's what seems to be implied by their responses to me. And so I said, well, in accordance with the statute, you need to provide me a schedule. And I will be willing to accept these documents on a rolling basis. So let's put together a schedule of, we can provide this month's period by this date or whatever. And we'll just start doing it that way. And they refused to do that. So that's why I went to the Board of Supervisors to complain, because the Board of Supervisors controls her budget. They don't have direct control over her office. They just have control over her budget. And since I'm looking into the budget, seems like a good place to complain, because the Arizona Ombudsman does not have jurisdiction over judicial offices. So after this, my next step would be to go to the Arizona Attorney General and ask them to open an investigation. And, when I originally asked for the records, I really thought that they would provide the records. They probably would have provided me a schedule to provide them, because it is a voluminous amount of material I've asked for.
I realize it's a lot.
And
but you got to start somewhere.
I thought I was going to put my concerns to rest. But since then, I've been batted around like a ping pong ball, and no one wants to help me. And I know what the law says they have to do, and they're not doing it. So a county attorney is breaking Arizona statutes. That's a problem. And it's a public transparency issue. So to the publicly elected officials in Pima County that have given me advice on how to proceed, I thank you. And I appreciate your dedication to transparency. And there's the Cliff Notes version of why Lower Conover's office probably doesn't really like me very much. I don't really care. I feel like we have to check it every week.
So I feel too. See if it's wet. Well, you're in rare form today. But you're drawing contrast from being extra stinky first.
I am dirty.
I know.
You made me that way.
I made? What? You start talking about meat, you might want to call me Dad. You ever fly on a bicycle? The wackadoodle theories abound.
I'm gonna have to start cutting off lips.
Do chickens even have lips?
I don't need to get intimately acquainted with the chicken's ass. No, but now I feel nauseated.
Calm down, weirdo. We didn't start the fire.
No, it was always burning since the world's been turning. And you can spank me for that later.
You'd like that, wouldn't you?
Or sometimes I get excited to tell you something, and I go, guess what? And by the time you go...
Your brain vapor locks or something.
By the time you go, what? I've already forgotten what it was.
You don't even understand my pain.
Was your mom a cat? Things have been weird here, y'all.
He's gonna buy us the real cheese.
Now you're... Look, you got me off track when you mentioned cheese. I really like cheese.
I'm gonna try not to cut myself on the way to get another beer.
Okay.
You people do know this is the kind of thing that's going to piss off Jesus, right? F*** you, I'm getting bread and never coming back.
You have a question?
No, I'm just horrified. I just don't have enough shoes for all the asses they belong in.
We should put that on a t-shirt.
I got a pot pie.
I love pot pie. Baby, I will always eat your pot pie.
No one thinks, man, I just want a pot pie today that I know of. Like you'll accept a pot pie, but it's like a consolation prize.
No, I love pot pie. Me and Cartman are all about the pot pie. Pot pie.
If you're not careful, your pot pie will hurt you. Why is it so dry and so wet at the same time?
This episode brought to you by pot pie, the only food that's both dinner and a lawsuit waiting to happen, because that gravy is approximately the temperature of molten copper for the first 9 bites.
Because there's no other way to get peas that hot.
This episode brought to you by pot pie, with a filling so hot it briefly lets you see the fourth dimension.
And Jesus.
This episode brought to you by pot pie, because the universe looked at soup and said, put that in a pastry and make it dangerous. You're right, it's not really soupy, unless you did it wrong.
Is that trying too hard or not hard enough?
I'll make it tolerable for you.
Got extra gravy.
Just trying to keep from undoing my progress in the home gym.
I'm just trying to keep from undoing all of known reality.
Yep.
You all think you're different than me? No, you are me.
All right, well, I'm out of words and society's out of grace, so let's all go stare off into the middle distance for a while. Crime to Burn is a production of Crime to Burn, LLC, where we light fires in your brain and not your buildings. All rights reserved. Still spiritually parched after this episode? It's okay, Steve believes in cross-pollination. Here's a trailer for a show we think deserves to infiltrate your ear holes, in a good way. Don't forget to leave a 5-star review before you go. Steve is watching.
Do you love true crime and travel? Having traveled the world solo the last couple of years and being obsessed with true crime, I found myself researching others who took the same vacations but never made it home. The Last Trip is a true crime podcast covering missing and murdered people that were living their best lives on vacation. I'm your host, Jamie Beebe, and each week I'll bring you on The Last Trip, taking a deep dive into vacation culture and travel spots, tips on staying alive while traveling, and ultimately recreating someone's last days in paradise. What led to their last trip? What are the hard facts? What is the final outcome? And could you be next? David Snedden was a 24-year-old college student from Utah attending Mandarin classes in Beijing when he mysteriously disappeared while hiking Tiger Leaping Gorge. Chinese authorities said he drowned in the gorge, and U.S. authorities agreed, although his body was never found and his parents didn't believe that. 7 years later, out of the blue, they got a phone call from a former U.S. official who had evidence David is still alive. This case sounds like a Hollywood movie, but evidence doesn't lie. So where is David Snedden? Famous rugby player and Celebrity X Factor contestant Levi Davis went missing in Barcelona last year while on a backpacking trip through Europe. Just days before he vanished, he posted a 15-minute video to his Instagram account saying his life was in danger and people were after him. After he disappeared, several theories emerged. But what really happened to Levi Davis? Join me, Jamie Beebe, co-host of the popular true crime series Strictly Stalking, as I embark on a brand new adventure combining true crime and travel. Listen to The Last Trip wherever you get your podcasts.